just like realizing that I need to go more in this direction of health. How do things align for yourself and your health? And it doesn't make any sense that I'm like making this other type of food. And that's slowing down and realizing what's good for you. And maybe it's in this other direction that I hadn't even really taken seriously before, but it's what's healthy.
Welcome to Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. I'm your host, Nikki Sizemore, and in this podcast, we explore the cultural influences around food and how food connects us and sometimes disconnects us to our minds, our bodies, our spirits, the earth, and our communities. We also talk about recipes, cooking tips, and more. This is a space that is dedicated to bringing more presence, ease, and joy into the process of feeding ourselves. Let's dive in. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the show. Today, I get to speak with one of my culinary idols, Liz Prueitt. Liz is a co-founder of the acclaimed Tartine Bakery in San Francisco. She is a James Beard Award-winning pastry chef and the author of 2 cookbooks, Tartine and Tartine All Day, which you'll hear has a prized spot on my kitchen shelf. She is also the publisher of the newsletter Have Your Cake, which is devoted entirely to gluten-free desserts. Liz shares her journey in becoming an acclaimed pastry chef, all while having a gluten intolerance, which she kind of ignored for many years as she pursued her career. She describes how she finally decided to focus on her health, which for her has meant cutting gluten out entirely, and what going gluten-free has taught her, as well as what it means for the work that she's doing today. We also explore the value of slowing down in terms of our health. Often we need to slow down in order to really tune into what our bodies need, but also in terms of the kitchen. Slowing down helps us become more mindful cooks. It allows us to be more thoughtful with the ingredients that we use, the techniques that we use when creating new recipes. Finally, be sure to stay tuned until the end because Liz shares some of her favorite summer dessert ideas. She offers some great tips, and I'll be sharing her gluten-free Madeleine recipe in the Mind, Body, Spirit, Food newsletter. So definitely hop over there. I'm recording this intro right after I just spoke with Liz, and as I mentioned in the episode, I haven't made a Madeleine since culinary school in 2005. I am so excited to make this recipe, which would be just the perfect pairing with summer fruits or a bowl of ice cream for an easy but elegant dessert. As always, an easy way that you can support this work is by sharing it with your people. Please spread the word. It really helps us out. You can also rate the podcast over on your podcast app, and you can become a subscriber to the Mind, Body, Spirit, Food newsletter where I share weekly recipes, cooking tips. We dive deep into some of these topics and we have fun. If you become a paid subscriber for just a few dollars a month, you make all of this work possible. This is an ad-free podcast and it could not happen without paid support. I'm so grateful for all of you who already contribute. I'll include a link in the show notes if you feel like helping out as well. All right, my friends, let's dive in. Liz, thank you so much for joining me today. It is such an honor to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I have to tell you that I have cookbooks all over my house, but I only have in my kitchen like the prized collection of maybe 6 cookbooks. And your book, Tartine All Day, is one of those books. And you've just long been such a culinary icon for me. And especially, I had to cut gluten out of my diet, in like 2012. And when that book came out, I'm not even sure when I bought the book that I knew that all of the recipes were gluten-free. And it was like Christmas all over again because I've always respected your work, but then all of a sudden, every recipe in the book I could make, which at that time, there weren't that many great gluten-free cookbooks on the market. So Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I want to start by asking you the first question that I ask all of my guests, and so we can get to know you a little bit better. But what is your cultural upbringing, and how has that influenced your relationship to food?
Was born in Brooklyn, grew up there until I was about 12 or 13. And my family's not Jewish, but we lived in a largely Jewish community. And so I grew up thinking my background is, my grandmother's Swedish on my mom's side. And then on my dad's side, a lot of farmers from Kentucky, very influenced by the Swedish side. But because we were surrounded by all this wonderful Jewish food and going to bar mitzvahs, and I really felt like bagels and lox were what everybody had, and latkes, and just all the wonderful food. And we also, in our neighborhood, a little further from our neighborhood in Brooklyn, had a wonderful Middle Eastern area, Atlantic Avenue. Used to be much bigger, but Sahadi's is still there. And family who's just really, and still are, my parents are both 87 and still both cook a lot. And
Wow.
they've always brought like a lot of adventurous kind of flavors and dishes to the table. And that goes back from being a kid.
Amazing. You said you lived there until you were 13. Did you stay in the city after that or moved
No,
elsewhere?
my family, I've always like had one foot in the city and one in the country. So after 13, and I have two younger sisters, my folks moved up north to Garrison, New York, about an hour and a half north of New York City.
I live about 15 minutes from Garrison in Cold
Oh,
Spring,
you're
right?
kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so funny. So you know the area, very
Yeah.
small town.
Yeah.
I don't know how my parents found it, but we just landed in a wonderful community. And my parents kind of went back to the land really hard. We had goats and ducks, and
Wow.
mom is a master gardener, still is very involved in that organization. And she just planted every inch of we had like a third of an acre of property that came with like some old apple trees and Concord grapes. And then she just added to it. Huge
Wow.
garden, lots of fruit growing. And dad kept bees, and we tapped maple trees, and we boiled down the sap to syrup. And so food was really central to my upbringing, and how it's grown and how it's made,
Yeah.
harvested, etc.
What a treat to first have that exposure to the city and the diversity of flavors that the city could provide, and then moving to that expression from the land and what the
Yeah.
land can provide, and having that kind of having your hands in the soil. Do you like to grow food? I know obviously you love to cook food, and we're going to get there, but
Yeah, I do now, although I will say it was such a culture shock when I was 13, moving from Brooklyn to this house from the 1700s that had no heat. The only heat that our house had was a wood-fired oven. And so it was a potbelly stove, now that I'm thinking about it. And so it was a culture shock. I didn't love it at first. Absolutely not. I missed my friends. I missed going to the corner pizza parlor, all that stuff of being a kid in the city and being able to walk outside and take the bus anywhere I wanted. And suddenly I wasn't able to do any of those things. And I didn't know what to make of my parents, like suddenly having goats running around. But now I appreciate it. And so, yes, now I live in San Francisco. I have a small patio overlooking the bay, and I've grown lots of things out there. During the pandemic and the beginning of it, I bought some nice, pretty big wooden planters and just had a whole wild vegetable garden out there. I've kind of pulled back a bit, but now I'm looking at like a lot of potted herbs. I have roses and figs and things like that, lots of lavender.
It's amazing to me what we can grow in a limited amount of space. Like, we still live in the country where, kind of like you described, we live on a mountain road, but we live on a small little mountaintop. And so my husband and I had to build these terraced beds, and we only have 4 boxes, but it's amazing what we can grow between those and the pots that we line the deck with.
It is remarkable.
It's so fun. And I have to say that he's the grower. I'm really not I harvest and cook, and he does the rest. So You lived in Garrison, which is just amazing to me. I know that you eventually went to culinary school. When did that passion for food begin? I mean, it sounds like you always had it, but when did you kind of know that you wanted to take
Yeah.
that route?
I did always have it, and I don't think I fully appreciated, maybe we all do this when we're young, we just don't know the things that are around us that we will later come to appreciate, and that's certainly the case with my grandmother baking a lot of Swedish foods and baked goods. She pickled her own herring and lovely braided, Swedish breads. And then my mom carrying on the tradition. My mom and dad both really encouraged me in the kitchen. So I just started baking. And then I had a catering business at one point, just like making baked goods for local families.
Wow.
And that's how I started. It was just something that I got a lot of positive feedback in the beginning when I was dyslexic and not doing great in school.
Mm.
And so it was sort of, like going towards the thing that makes more sense where you get more fulfillment because school was hard.
Yeah.
And I knew I was dyslexic from a very young age, actually, but I don't think I fully understood the ramifications of it as I got older and how hard high school and college would become.
Mm.
So I just sort of naturally gravitated to cooking and baking, especially baking.
That's so interesting. That became that outlet of feeling successful,
Yeah.
really, in the kitchen, which is so beautiful. You eventually went to the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde
Right.
Park. So I went to the French Culinary Institute in the city. And so there was the pastry department. So you could either do pastry or you could do kind of the culinary side. Was
Right.
that the same thing there? Was there a specific focus that you had, or did you kind of just do the whole thing?
It is funny because it's sort of like a ne'er the twain shall meet. There's like, you
Yeah.
just go into culinary or it's really unusual
Yeah.
for there to be crossover. I started in their culinary arts program.
Hmm.
I went through that. And then their baking and pastry program was fairly new. I decided that I just didn't really know what I wanted to do after that, after graduating from the first program. So I stayed and I went through the baking and pastry program, which I loved. And I think that's where, and I really went through the culinary program because it was the area I was not as strong in.
Oh,
And
interesting.
I was 28 when I went. So I was definitely like one of the older people in my class. And there's also very few women, at least at that time, who attended. And so I felt like I wanted to become more well rounded. But then I was missing the baking and pastry. And I thought, I'm just going to do this. And I'm really glad that I did because it just really strengthened those skills.
Yeah. So I think for a lot of listeners, we know you as Tartine, and I think a lot of people are familiar. What was that gap like? Like, what happened in between those two times, between culinary school and then the opening of your business?
I got married. After graduating from culinary school, my then husband, Chad, and I went to France for almost a year.
Mm.
And he was studying bread baking. And I went along without too much of a plan, but ended up working with pastry chefs in the two major places that we ended up. One was in the south of France in the Var region, and the other one was in the Haute-Savoie. And that was a really incredible period. And I always tell people to, like, after they graduated, or if you don't go to culinary school, travel
Mhm.
anywhere. Our background at the time, because we went to culinary school, was in a more sort of traditional European style. Chad knew the type of bread that he wanted to study baking. And so I kind of just followed suit. But I would go anywhere in the world and study any cuisine or as many as I possibly could before
Mhm.
you kind of land and start taking jobs. It's invaluable. So after we came back from doing that, we found a spot in Point Reyes Station, Marin County, California, and we just started a wood-fired oven bakery. And I baked off the residual heat of the wood oven. And this is the style that we studied in France. So it was what we were familiar with, but how we knew to start baking. And yeah, I think that took us up to 2000. And then we were in Mill Valley for 2 very brief years and then moved on to San Francisco. We opened our place in San Francisco in 2002.
So it was really fascinating for me to read your background on your Substack newsletter because you said that you actually were diagnosed by a chiropractor in 1987.
That's right.
That you were that maybe I don't know if it was that you were gluten intolerant or what the chiropractor diagnosed you with, but essentially that you shouldn't be eating gluten. And in hearing your story, that didn't register with you, or what was that? How did this
Well,
happen?
as I point out in the Substack, in writing it, I can see clearly now, it's hindsight's 2020. It makes no sense. I knew from 87 that I was gluten intolerant. I didn't go to a doctor. As you rightly say, I was diagnosed by a chiropractor. And when I say diagnosed, I started seeing her because I was having these upper back problems. And I'd had them for a long time. I've always had stomach problems. I did see New York City doctors. Not one of them suggested it could have been something I was eating. And I eventually got diagnosed at that time this was pre-1987, with an ulcer. And they prescribed Zantac, and that was kind of it before Zantac was over the counter. It took the pain away, but obviously it wasn't treating the root cause, and I didn't know what the root cause was. I was assuming the doctor was right. But I was still having these upper back pains. So I went to my boyfriend's chiropractor, and she said, "Oh, it just really sounds a lot like what I was just diagnosed. Why don't you just try stop eating wheat?" And I'd never heard of that being
1987. No, it was not
no.
normal.
She was definitely, or whoever diagnosed her especially, was really ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
And I did. I stopped eating wheat. I immediately just threw all my food away that had wheat in it, bought they had decent rice pasta then. Not a lot though, as you know, it's really been a very long evolution for food companies, but also grain millers, and just to even get the raw ingredients to bake with. And I certainly wasn't really baking much. I kind of just cut the food out. But it was like a miracle. I, within days, was feeling so much better. My stomach stopped hurting. I was very, very underweight, and that stopped because I was eating food and just not digesting it. It was just running right through me. And that immediately cleared up. And so over the months, just everything started to improve. I always had brain fog. I didn't know. I thought maybe it was because of dyslexia. I now know I have ADHD as well, which contributed. A lot of it is tied together the more I'm reading. And I'm sure you know a lot more about that than I do, but it is interesting. And I was only diagnosed with ADHD last year, but eating the wheat early on, and my mom was a wonderful baker and made all of her own breads, but constant brain fog, just all those symptoms that you read about, I had in spades.
It's so interesting because I had a similar experience. I suppose it was my microbiome. My stomach was in such tatters, it felt like. And cutting out gluten within 2 weeks, I felt like a different person. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have been living my level of what I thought was normal was so in so much pain, really, and so much fog as well.
Yes.
For me, since it helped so much, it became easy. That was the thing that made it easy for me to cut out gluten, because at that time I was in total denial. I was working as a food stylist. I was working in production, recipe development. I didn't know if I could continue my job. I was so ashamed, actually. I was like, oh, no one can know this about me. I didn't tell anybody. And I wonder that about you, because you found this out early, but this was before you went to culinary school, correct?
It was before culinary school, and I was working in restaurants. I've always worked in restaurants my whole life in various capacities, or caterers. And so food continued to be a really big part of my life. I only considered one other profession, and that was photojournalism, but I kept sort of veering back to food and cooking and baking. And yeah, it just took me a long time to fully understand the long-term health consequences of
Mm.
continuing to eat like a little bit of wheat.
Hmm.
I'm not celiac, so the line of
Right.
where I could eat a little
Yeah.
bit and I
Right.
could taste and I kind of knew where that line was. And if I just stopped, the stomach aches would go away. This was
Yeah.
also obviously pre-internet. Now you can find out all about it. There's wonderful websites, so much information, and that just didn't exist back then.
Yeah.
I remember coming to one medical library here in San Francisco, and I was able to look up a few things there, but still, there just wasn't that much information that was accessible.
Yeah.
So, to answer the question of, why would I continue in a profession that I knew wasn't inherently good for me, making things that other people could eat and I couldn't? It was really because I kind of sectioned it off in my mind. Like, I have a medical condition and I can manage it.
Mm.
And this over here is my profession. And it still doesn't really make sense entirely. But it was also something I loved doing so
Yeah.
much and found, traction in and accolades and success. And it was almost unthinkable that I would just stop. At that point, too, you have to remember that we didn't have, this is going back 15 years, 20 years to the beginning of Tartine. We simply didn't have the variety of grains,
Yeah.
the level of milling that we have now, the understanding, the public perception. Nobody really wanted to seek out gluten-free
Yeah.
goods because they just weren't good.
Yeah.
We all remember that. That
Yeah. That
reputation,
was
I think,
awful.
follows us to today. You
Definitely.
know, you can still hear people, make comments about gluten-free food and baked goods. They're just like dust. They're flavorless. They're
Stodgy. Yes.
stodgy. Exactly. All those things. Yeah.
Yeah. So when did you start really embracing being gluten free? When did you start developing recipes? Clearly, times have changed. It's become
Mhm.
easier and easier. Even just 12 years ago, almond flour was not easy for me to find. I had to often make my own, and I made my own oat flour. And now we have oh my gosh, it's just so commonplace. Was it a gradual thing where you just had access to more of these ingredients, started experimenting with them, or was there a conscious shift to say, okay, I'm going to start devoting more attention to developing recipes that are purposefully gluten free?
I think it was that. It was a gradual shift. Of course, I did some baking at home, right before we left to do that period of work and travel in France. I briefly lived in Chico, California. And this was for about I don't know, we were there for a year, 2 years. I can't remember now. But I mention it because we worked at a very hippie, originally French bakery there called Wunderbrot.
Hmm.
And that bakery was started by a French guy who used all whole grains and alternative grains, lots of alternative grains. And I actually learned a tremendous amount of what I understand about, for instance, flax seeds. People made these like nuggets. It was a long time ago, but they made some really interesting food there. And we were hired from the East Coast because this young couple took over the bakery and they needed a pastry chef and a bread baker. And we fit the bill. So we decided, let's move out west. And that was our introduction to California, was this really funny little hippie French bakery. But many roads converged there. It's what brought us to France. It was, got us more training, but it's also what started on this understanding of how to work with some of these more alternative flours and
Mm.
also almond flour and just lots of other things that I'd never even heard of. So, we owe a lot to our hippie forebears.
Yeah.
Because, I'll also say that one thing that I really find lacking, and it certainly holds today, is that when you go like really into gluten-free baking, and there's lots of websites out there and books now, but a lot of the recipes are based purely on starch. And this
Yeah.
really bothers me.
Yeah.
And it's like we've gone all the way from like these health food nuggets that are like little hockey pucks to, yes,
Yeah.
it looks good. And yes, it tastes good. But I also get like a total starch crash, sugar, like simplified starch crash,
100%.
right?
Yes.
And
Yep.
it's great that we can understand better how ingredients work and that we've, discovered how to modify tapioca starch so that it can hold, more liquid in a recipe. It will do some of the things that gluten does that we can't use, and it'll hold CO2 and it'll make something puffy, but we're also just eating pure starch.
Mm.
And I really try hard to not go all the way down that road. People ask me sometimes, like, what is it that you wish you could have? And I wish I could have pizza or focaccia or something that is like what we've made at Tartine with our
Yeah.
bread. But most of the recipes now, it's like that pure starch. And I
Yeah.
just don't want to eat that. I
Yeah.
don't feel good after it. I like a few bites because I miss it. I miss the crunchy texture and the soft interior and the big fluffy bubbles that you can get when you bake with gluten. So that's the current state of gluten-free baking and what I'm trying to work around.
Mm. It's such a great point and such a great challenge. And I'm so glad you're working on it. Because while I love to bake, as my listeners and readers know, my baking is very simple. I'm like wholesome, simple, simple, simple. I'm not out to recreate perfect breads, but I love that there are gluten-free bakers out there who are doing the kind of work
Yeah.
that you do that is really technical, much more technique based than the baking I do. And I think you're right. It's almost like we have this nostalgia for the things that we had eaten in the past. I mean,
Right.
you and I had to cut out gluten, when I was a woman. And so I have all these memories of foods that I want to eat again. But the reality is, it's kind of like eating a vegetarian burger that's trying to make the burger taste like beef. And the point is, you can have a delicious veggie burger that tastes like vegetables. It's very different from a beef burger. But
Yes.
embracing some of these alternative flours means
Yeah.
we're going to have different textures and flavors. And it takes some getting used to, but there's so much adventure there. And I think it
Yeah.
can also be really exciting.
Yep.
That leads me actually, there's a quote in your book, Tartine All Day, that I love. And it said that limitations often become the best teachers. What has cutting gluten out of your diet taught you?
I think that what I was talking about there is that any creative thing that you want to do and you put parameters around it, you
Mhm.
figure out ways to make things work. And so I'm certainly that way. So if you say, come up with, I don't know, a yellow cake recipe and you can only use these ingredients, go and see what you can create. And that actually was one of the more kind of traditional recipes that does rely on the starches.
Mhm.
But, come on, you just have to sometimes have a piece of delicious cake.
Absolutely. Yes.
It's you won't eat it every day,
Right.
but and when we want it, we want a nice recipe for it. And so it just stretches you when you
Mm.
have to start seeking like and reading and researching and go to the store and just look what's on the shelves. What am I not using? That's how I started using teff flour, for instance.
Mhm.
I always liked injera bread that's made with teff. And I thought, well, what can I do with this? And you experiment with it. Or buckwheat crepes is like
Mm.
something that, it's called sarrasin in French. And actually the crepes made with sarrasin are called galettes. And those are delicious. And so I started experimenting. And even when I go to France and I have a sweet crepe, I ask for it with the buckwheat sarrasin.
Mhm.
But then you start making other things with it and it makes things more interesting and it does
Mhm.
stretch you. And I feel in the end more accomplished.
Yeah. You had the challenge. I just had an episode with Julia Scarpaleggia, who's an Italian cook, an Italian who loves cheese, and she just had to cut dairy out of her diet. So our conversation was this journey that she's just recently embarked upon. And we talked about that, how when the focus is the scarcity idea of what you have to cut out, it's kind
Mhm.
of like this freeze, awful experience. But when the focus can be, okay, this thing is happening. What can I bring in? What are the ingredients that I haven't experimented with? What are things that I can now play around with and kind of open my blinders to that maybe I haven't tried before? For me, at least, that's when things became very exciting being
Yeah.
a gluten-free chef. I was like, oh, wait, now, okay, you're exactly right. I remember carrot cake was for me one, okay, I want to make a carrot cake. Let's do this. And then in succeeding to develop something like that, there is this sense of like,
Yeah.
oh, yes.
It's such a good feeling because it's kind of just like putting the pieces of a puzzle together, but
Mhm.
like one of those crazy puzzles that you don't, it's like all blue or
Yeah.
something. It's like just,
I hate those puzzles.
this puzzle's cool. I love the page soft puzzle, but it makes you slow down and really be more thoughtful in
Mm.
how, like, okay, you know where the edges are.
Mhm.
It's just like a methodical way of going about it. And I've made a cake before. I know how to do this. This is just different. What are the properties of this ingredient? If I like the flavor of it, how is it going to marry with other flavors? Is it viscous when it gets moisture like buckwheat is? Like, what can we do with that? So it's really fun. Like, I love playing with my food.
Yeah, obviously. I love that. I also love how you use the words slow down and thoughtful. These are two words that I have been writing about a lot this spring. A lot of the theme of this season for me in my life has been about slowing down and simplifying and streamlining. And in order to simplify and streamline, we do have to slow down and we have to get mindful of what we want in our lives and what we don't want in our lives. And I think this is a good tip for just cooks at home experimenting to get mindful about what ingredients as you're playing will enhance this dish, or are there things that we can cut back just to be more deliberate. And there's a lot of joy in that slowing down. We live in such a rushed culture and we want the perfect
Yeah.
thing every time. And it's like
Yeah.
maybe the process itself can become the thing.
I think that was really what brought me to the present where I started Have Your Cake Substack. I'm not involved anymore in the day to day of Tartine. I mean, I really can't be. I just like, I decided I'm not even tasting anymore. I
Mm.
have to take care of my health. And just like realizing that I need to go more in this direction of health. How do things align for yourself and your health? And it doesn't make any sense that I'm like making this other type of food.
Mm.
And that slowing down and realizing what's good for you. And maybe it's in this other direction that I hadn't even really taken seriously before, but it's what's healthy. And you really have to, like, I couldn't imagine being Italian and suddenly realizing,
It's really hard. And I know I have other friends with other food intolerances, and it's not easy because it impacts so much of our life and our identities. As you know, you and I work in the food profession. And yet, when we can take control of that and start to prioritize ourselves
yep,
outside of any idea of I want to like separate this like very distinctly. This has nothing to do with diet culture. This has nothing to do with like I
mhm,
should be eating a certain way because this is a fad, or this is truly because for particular bodies handle particular things well and
yep,
other things not well. But
right,
when we can take control of that, it is like, okay, we're going to prioritize ourselves. And
right.
that's a scary thing to do. It's also a very empowering thing to do, but maybe not something we're taught to do.
Yeah, I think it's all of those things. And look, I also had a business partner at the time and a marriage that we were known for the bread baking.
Yeah.
At one point, early on, it was pastry, and then, he became known for bread. And it would not even have been like considered that I would try making anything in the bread area gluten-free.
Hmm.
And he's, arguably one of the best known bread makers in America, at least.
Mhm.
And so, gluten-free stuff was definitely scoffed at,
Yeah.
both in the European tradition of baking that we mostly did, although oddly, they're light years ahead of us in gluten-free baking, which is just so funny. If you go to
Mm.
France or the UK or Italy, I was in Florence in a nice small hotel, and they had a beautiful gluten-free breakfast
Yeah.
buffet of like all these tarts and pastries. It was remarkable. So they're so far ahead, but coming here, there wasn't the same kind of like knowledge of use of ingredients or something. But in our vein of baking, gluten-free just wasn't done. And so that's
Yeah.
why I just like kept it to the side. And yeah, it's just, you have to really slow down and do what's better for you.
Mm. I love this. And I feel like now I want to pivot because all of this talk of all of these gluten free tarts and things, I want to pick your brain for a second.
Yeah.
This episode is airing in the start of June. We are heading into summer. Can you share some of the things that you love to bake in the summer? I know we don't often think of baking in the summer, but I actually love baking in the summer and highlighting fruits and ingredients that are available this time of year. What are you looking forward to making?
Well, I love trifles. You make them ahead, they're cold, you use, leftover cake. Two things are popping to mind. I love a blueberry muffin. And, and an interesting thing about muffin mixes is that they actually benefit from a little bit of holding in the fridge. And
Mm.
this is something that anybody who's worked in a restaurant kitchen knows, or a bakery knows, is that there are certain mixes like madeleines are the same way, where, or financiers, there are a number of things where you can make the batter and hold it in the
Mm.
fridge. And then it's just like scoop and bake. So with gluten-free flours, as we know, sometimes or often, usually, they benefit from being in longer contact with wet ingredients before baking so that they have time to hydrate. Most gluten-free pastries that we're talking about are made with predominantly white rice, brown rice, which they just don't get as finely milled as any of the other starches, tapioca, corn, etc. So with a blueberry muffin recipe, you can make it up, have it in the fridge, and scoop and bake.
Mm.
Same thing with madeleines. I developed a lovely madeleine recipe. Get the perfect little hump on top. You don't have to freeze the plaque as some people insist upon. It's just like a perfect little recipe. And madeleines are so nice in the summer too because they bake in like 6 or 7 minutes.
Oh,
And so
man.
you
Yeah.
have your mix in the fridge, you got a quick little bake, and then you can have it with whatever, fruit salad or ice cream, whatever.
Oh my gosh. I have never made madeleines, and now I'm sitting here thinking, what is wrong with me? Why haven't I made madeleines?
They have a
I
reputation for being really finicky, but I don't know, the recipe I developed, they're not finicky, and they're reliable, and they're delicious.
Mm.
And yeah, they're just such a fun, and they're so pretty.
They're so beautiful. And you're right. That's like a perfect summer little treat because you can pair it with, I mean, just like slice up some peaches or plums and madeleines. I can't think of a more gorgeous dessert
Yeah.
to lay on the table. Speaking of peaches and plums, stone fruits, is there anything that you particularly
Mm.
love to do with stone fruits?
Well, my number one favorite recipe is like an old time, and I think most people are going to know what I'm talking about who have read the New York Times at all for their recipes. And that is the infamous plum torte, right? And I haven't yet translated that to a gluten-free recipe, but it's definitely something that I'll be working on. And besides that, and I love plums just so, so much.
Mm.
They're juicy, but they also have like a nice combo of sweet and tart, is just a simple baked plum tart in a tart shell where the juices reduce and get
Hmm.
thicker and the tips get a little burnt. I love that kind of a tart.
Oh my gosh. I'm getting so excited for
Mhm.
all of
Yeah, I'm
this.
getting excited for it too. I keep checking I mean, we're almost in full on summer here. And I know as of a week ago, it was snowing in some places in the States.
Oh my
Right.
gosh.
We kind of forget here.
Yeah. Well, we're recording this at the end of May or kind of mid-May, and it is freezing today. I mean, I had a sweater
Yes.
on before I was like, I'm not going to wear a sweater during this video because it is
Yeah,
airing in June, but it is one of those days where it's like, okay, I know it's coming, but please hurry up.
exactly.
Well, thank you so much. We'll be sure to direct everybody to your new newsletter, which is fabulous,
Thank you.
and link to some of these recipes if you've got links there.
Yeah.
I have one last question for you, and it's a fun one. It's the last question I ask all of my guests, and that is, it's your last meal on earth. What would it be?
Yes. I think a simple fruit galette.
Mm,
There's really just nothing like, a peach or an apricot,
yes.
one of those like dead of summer, beautiful fruits with reduced juices and like its own natural sweetness. It's in like a perfect little crust.
Pie is my favorite food. And so you just like sang a love letter to exactly what I would want.
That's exactly it. Yeah, I love pie too. Yep,
It's the best.
that's it.
Well, Liz, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome so much. This was really fun.
Thank you so much for listening. If this work resonates with you in any way, you can support it by leaving a review or comment or sharing it with friends. Also, you can sign up for the newsletter, Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. And by becoming a paid member for just $5 a month, you help fund this entire project. Thank you so much to all of you who are already subscribed, especially to those paid subscribers. This work could not happen without you. I'm Nikki Sizemore, and as always, remember to nourish yourself with intention and love.